Austin. We get paid on results. Lawyers get paid by the time, so I will not use all my time, I promise you. But I do have some good news to bring you from what happened during the legislative session. And I also have a couple issues I want to talk to you about. There's a few things that were kind of overriding the previous legislative session that kind of led to the special session and kind of where we ended up that I want to talk about for a moment. But first of all, the team that represents this organization in Austin, Joey Park and Robert Howard and Susan Kitty are very effective at what they do. We all work together. Eddie Solis, who is a colleague of mine who came with me today, a native of Kingsville, is real important to what we do in Austin. We work together also in coalitions many times on issues important to South Texas landowners, to ranchers, and to hunters. And those are a few of the items that I want to talk about a little bit. But overall, the legislative session was a very, very difficult session. And it was dominated by a conflict of priorities between the leadership offices. The Speaker, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor were not on the same page, as you may or may not have read. And it led us to a session that was very difficult. And then you throw into the mix very divisive issues such as sanctuary cities, voter ID, bathrooms, vouchers. I'm sure y'all heard about a lot of this stuff. That all created a very tense situation. Our sessions in Austin are 140 days. And that sounds like enough time to get all this stuff done. The first 60 days, you can only consider bills that the governor puts as priorities. He only put 5 issues as priorities. So take 60 days off from 140. They don't work weekends. They stop on Thursdays. They don't work Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays until May. So take another 30 days off. We're really left with about 30 to 40 days of real work to get all the business of Texas done. And very complicated, very issues that have conflict and have two sides, as the condemnation and the eminent domain issue was. Those take time. Very rarely is a bill that big going to pass in the first session. The members of the legislature come from everyday walks of life. These guys are citizens. They come to Austin. They're not experts in all of these areas. They have a lot coming at them. 6,000 bills filed in a regular session. About 1,200 of those pass, about 18%. It's much easier to kill bills than it is to pass bills. The system is set up just, there's a big funnel. And I mentioned, the days are, dwindling down. You've got all this legislation coming. And, very little at the end can get done without a lot of support and a lot of effort. I do want to mention that the legislature is changing. And since I've been lobbying for over 20 years now, we've really seen a shift from more of a rural legislature to a more urban legislature. And this is because of the population movement in Texas is moving out of the rural areas into the urban areas. Every 10 years they redraw the district based on these population shifts. And what that means is that you get more rural members of the more urban members of the legislature and fewer rural members of the legislature. And when you've got a really good member that understands what's going on, your issues in Austin, we need to keep them. And Ryan Guillen, who left here a few minutes ago, is one of those guys. He's very, very effective. And a couple of the bills I'm going to talk about in a minute were directly related to him and the committee that he chairs in Austin. If it wasn't for Ryan, his staffer Ben that was here, and the work that they did, we could have had a very different outcome in Austin on some very important issues. So the three issues that I've been asked to talk about and touch on today are brackish groundwater, kind of this whole groundwater issue we're dealing with, the open space land tax exemption that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and then chronic wasting disease, and briefly on fever tick. So all those issues were very positive in their outcome for STPRA members. Let me talk about the groundwater first. In 2015, the legislature passed House Bill 30, which directed the Texas Water Development Board to go out and develop and identify these brackish groundwater production zones in 4 aquifers by 2016 and in all aquifers by 2020. The legislature gave them $2 million to do that, so they went out and that's what they did. And so that's what they're identifying is which aquifers have brackish groundwater that can be developed to drinking water standards. So, come into this session, a follow-up bill was filed by Representative Lyle Larson from San Antonio, who's chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, a very powerful member of the legislature. He filed House Bill 2377 that created a process for issuing permits for this brackish groundwater. And it did a lot of different things, but one of the things that it did was it set up oversight over these permits with the Texas Water Development Board in Austin rather than with the local groundwater district. And that caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. Representative Larson created some of his own problems, and he's been very public about these, with a feud he got into with the governor over an ethics bill that was very public. And that also kind of played into the result of the brackish groundwater bill, which was ultimately vetoed by Governor Abbott. And in his veto message, he said that the process was, it had too many layers, that, you know, Austin didn't need to be involved. These need to be local decisions. And as you know, the court system and the legislature has said that local groundwater districts is the preferred way to regulate groundwater in Texas. Groundwater is a private property right. It's your right to develop and use that water as long as you do it in a beneficial way. And that's been the long-standing, that's been recognized in the courts and by the legislature as a long-standing provision. And this bill would have put a crack in that by giving the Water Development Board oversight over a groundwater district. So that bill was ultimately vetoed. The next bill, the open space land use exemption, you're probably aware of this, those of you that have oil and gas operations on your property, but county appraisers started looking around and they were looking at property that had an ag, a timber, or a wildlife exemption. And if you had oil and gas operations on there, then they made efforts to remove those exemptions and then go back. This was the kicker. And then they would go back 5 years and assess taxes, and they would add a 7% interest on top of that. So it was really, you know, an attempt to shake down a lot of landowners. So Representative Drew Darby from San Angelo filed House Bill 3198. The bill was passed, and the bill provides that if an ag, timber, or wildlife exemption is removed because of an oil and gas activity, the landowner cannot be subject to those rollback taxes. So that was a very good piece of legislation that Governor Abbott signed, and it should help those of you that have these county and taxing appraisal districts looking at your operations in relation to these exemptions that you may have on other parts of your ranches. Now, one bill we spent a lot of time on, actually it was a lot of bills, and you've already heard it mentioned here a couple times, is relation to chronic wasting disease. And chronic wasting disease, let me take you back to how we got to where we are today. About 2 years ago, in 2015, CWD was detected in a white-tailed deer in Medina County in a breeding operation. That set off a series of Parks and Wildlife activities to identify and contain the disease. As you've heard, the big threat to the native deer herds is if this disease was to get out in the native deer herds. Not only would it be a threat to the hunting industry, which is a huge industry in Texas, but also to private property rights. So this was something that was very concerning to a lot of people. Subsequently, another case of CWD was discovered in Lavaca County. So the Parks and Wildlife came in and issued some emergency rules around the movement of these deer and the testing of these breeder deer to try to determine where the disease was coming from. This led to a more permanent rule adopted by Parks and Wildlife, the Texas Deer Association on one side, a coalition of landowner groups, of hunting groups, cattle raisers, Farm Bureau, low fence, landowners, and property rights owners on the other side. And we were representing a group that's here. Many of them are here today. We're very active in this issue. So that brought us up to the legislative session. Also, as part of that, a lawsuit was filed to vacate the Parks and Wildlife rules by a couple breeder operations. So headed into the session, it was very divisive between the deer breeder organizations and the hunting and property rights organizations. A number of bills were filed, 10, 12 bills were filed during the session that would have done a number of things, but they were all kind of focused on rolling back the CWD rules. At the end of the day, none of those bills passed. We were lucky to get out of the session as we did. Most of them all went to Chairman Guillen's committee. He was very, very helpful. Tracy King, very helpful. And we had a very productive session. So that's what happened in Austin. I appreciate your time. My time is up. Thank you very much.